All right. How many of you guys have ever built a REST API before? By show of hands. Okay, awesome. That's a pretty good amount of you guys. How many of you guys, sorry, this mic. How many of you guys, do I have to stand in this particular, it's just too close. Okay, I'm gonna hold it right here. How many of you guys have ever built a partner API before?
Let's try this one. It's less sensitive.
Okay.
It's just don't hold it so much.
This one seems better. All right, how many of you guys have ever built? I'm gonna just keep it right here. How many? This one's good. I'm gonna keep it right here. If I raise it again, just somebody just be like, okay. How many of you guys have ever built a partner API before? Nobody? Nobody. Nobody's ever built an integration with a third party? Sort of. Some people in the back. Awesome. That's what we're gonna be talking about today. So, brief introduction about me. My name is Ryan Caloras, as Dan had already mentioned. Currently a lead engineer at Instagram working on the Explore team, which is an awesome team. But before that, I was at another really awesome company for the last 4 years called Gilt.com, where I was working as a lead engineer and engineering manager building Scala microservices and partner APIs. I'm no longer with Gilt, but thank you. But if I say we throughout this talk, I'm referring to Gilt. Old habits die hard. I currently live in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and I heart REST APIs. So this is the question for the talk today. I'm going to keep coming back to this, and I'm going to be essentially talking about some best practices and sort of an overarching story of how we solved or addressed this question at Gilt. By show of hands, how many of you guys have heard of Gilt? Awesome. Everybody in New York City has always heard of Gilt. Just in case for the people who haven't, Gilt is an e-commerce company that was founded in 2007. It primarily specializes in flash sales and luxury designer goods. So really high-end fashion like Armani, Louis Vuitton, Kate Spade, Burberry. We write a lot of Scala code. And in 2016, it was acquired by Hudson's Bay Company, which is the parent company for Saks Fifth Avenue and Lord & Taylor. So also a picture of our iPad and iOS app in all its glory, just so you guys get an idea what it looks like. I'm going to get into the story now, I guess, of how we built this partner API. So in late 2014, Gilt had a lot of excess inventory. So what that means is it's essentially a product that we can't sell on the site, or it doesn't sell. And so what we do is we discount it. And if it still doesn't sell, eventually we don't put it back on the site. Part of Gilt's experience is to keep the site fresh and keep people coming back to it every day. And if we put the same stuff on it, people don't want to come back and see the same stuff. So we had a lot of excess inventory that we couldn't move. At the same time, the market for luxury goods in China was taking off. And our international team actually recognized that. And we started going ahead and increasing our business internationally, primarily targeting Asia. We started selling directly to consumers in places like China and Korea, and we were actually already established in Japan with Gilt.jp, and we had an office there in Tokyo. But there was actually an opportunity to do something much larger and work with some of the major players that were already established in the space. So enter big Chinese e-commerce companies. These are partners that are very big, that are looking to purchase large amounts of product. So an example of that would be, I'm Alibaba and I want to purchase 100 Michael Kors watches. Or I'm JD.com and I want to purchase 1,000 Kate Spade handbags. So our international team actually saw this opportunity and saw the excess inventory that we had and began selling directly to these partners in this very manual, offline way. But it actually proved to be a successful business, and we made some money there. But it wasn't scalable. So the problem at hand was, how do we increase the throughput of this business and also onboard more business partners? And so international came to engineering, and they said this to us. And of course, engineering's response was, let's build a partner API. And so my team and I were the ones who were responsible for actually building this thing. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to be coming back to about 3 points that have to do with solving this question and sort of the best practices with each of them. First, we're going to go ahead and define what you're building. Second, we're going to talk about actually building it. And third, we're going to talk about onboarding partners. And this is not necessarily a linear progression. I can tell you that the way that we onboarded our 10th partner was definitely not the same way that we onboarded our launch partners. So there's definitely going back and building and onboarding and so on. So define what you're building. Now this might seem obvious to some of you guys, but if you've never built a third-party integration before, you might try to go ahead and do like the most immediate solution possible. I think that looks something like this when we were trying to build it. And so what I'm trying to show, at least with this graphic, was with our earliest partners, we were trying to actually build these very highly customizable, kind of like direct integrations. And this had all sorts of problems. Eventually, we kind of moved to something like this. And then eventually, we got to something like this. And what we realized was we're actually building a platform. And we're building a platform, and we want partners to integrate with us instead of us integrating with them. This was kind of an epiphany that we had very early on. And the main lesson or takeaway, at least from this, is to build scalable solutions rather than customized ones. OK, build it. So while there's a ton of different ways that you can build a partner API, there definitely are some best practices. So partner APIs a lot of times can be implemented sort of as just lightweight proxies to some sort of underlying data. This is especially true if your API is only supposed to be read-only. So if you're just trying to have people fetch things like GIFs or like some sort of data. Here's a couple of architectural diagrams which we'll walk through real quick. The one on the right side here, which I'm calling a proxy API, is an implementation where you sort of just have this proxy service or module which really doesn't do much except for maybe just authentication and whitelisting or blacklisting of requests that then just proxies to an underlying service. This was actually the implementation which we went with for our global partner API for this story. On the left-hand side over there is an implementation we'd refer to as the agnostic API, which is essentially just a service which is more or less agnostic to the client that's talking to it. So it doesn't really care if the request is already coming from like one of your internal systems or if it's coming from an external partner. I saw this in practice at Gilt with our 3PL, third-party logistics API, which essentially was just something that would receive orders and drop them to our warehouse. At Gilt, we actually did fulfillment for other e-commerce companies. So our order fulfillment system would be agnostic to the company that was actually dropping the order. So you just say, drop SKU 123 with quantity 2 for Gilt, or drop SKU 345 quantity 1 for Theory or for Helmut Lang. And that service didn't care if it was coming from either. They would just handle the request. Of course, in the agnostic API, you'd also do things like authentication and whitelisting and blacklisting in addition. So this next point is actually more of a REST best practice, I'd say, for designing APIs. I would highly recommend, at least what we had done with the partner API was defining it with an API description language. So something like a Swagger, Rommel, API doc.me. A lot of companies have internal versions of these as well, so you guys have maybe had something internally that you designed for your company's APIs. But there's been an explosion in popularity of these over the last few years, and I think it's for good reason. What these things allow you to do is awesome, and especially if we're working with third parties and partners, because it allows you to go ahead and describe your API in a language agnostic way, and then very easily collaborate with other people on it. And even more powerful, you can generate things like documentation, or even better for your partners, generate them clients. So a partner will come to you and say, hey, I want to get into production. I want to go ahead and get integrated with you guys really fast. And then, OK, what programming language are you using? Oh, I'm using Python. And you could just generate a client for them immediately. Or better yet, they could do it themselves with your specification. The last point is another REST best practice. But again, even more so for partner APIs, these are really important to adhere to. And that's making sure that endpoints are idempotent, especially if they're mutating or creating things. This is a huge pain if it's not, because you can get things like duplicates. How many people are familiar with what idempotent means? Handful of hands. I'll go into a definition real quick. Essentially what this would mean is that the server would be in the same state regardless of requests being repeated multiple times. So if you have a create order request, for example, you could submit that same request 5, 6 times. It doesn't matter if it failed the first one and you didn't know if it actually succeeded or not. You'll never actually end up with a duplicate order. For anything where you're dealing with transactions, especially financial, this is like essential. And I'm proud to say that we didn't receive one duplicate order through our API because of this. Almost all modern APIs, Stripe is actually a perfect example of this, use idempotency keys, or their endpoints are idempotent by default. Okay, this is the fun part, step 3, onboarding partners. So to successfully onboard a partner, we need them to integrate with us, and we would also then need to get them into production and actually having their first sale. When we started doing that initially, this was like setting up meetings, this was like hopping on calls, this was going into chat and trying to talk to people and be like, okay, like, is your integration set? Like, are you ready to go to production? All this stuff. That sucked. It didn't scale. It didn't work. What we realized was that we actually needed to invest in more of a standardized process and a way to communicate that out to people. So we invested really heavily in having great documentation that was accessible and had really, really clear examples for integrating. These are just a couple of screenshots from our documentation. We had used this little site called readme.io, which was a Y Combinator startup that's just basically hosts documentation. But I can tell you this was one of the biggest ROIs that we saw, at least with our process, was just having very accessible documentation. And I will tell you that people judge an API by its documentation. It also becomes something that at least we found our team really rallied around as sort of a source of truth in regards to, okay, this is what the API does, or this is our process for actually getting on board with it. And not only were the engineers actually editing it, but we found that our product managers and international team ended up using this probably more than we did, actually, and became the ones who were actually editing it. And this is after the design and endpoints and models were already added. This is more adding things like FAQs and things with the partner onboarding process. The most important thing from this, though, I thought, was our documentation conveyed a very clear path on how to get to production. That was probably the most common question we got was, hey, how do I get an API token? Or, hey, how do I get to production? And if you look at the first line on the documentation up there, it says how to get your API key. You would be, I was so surprised how many partners would still ask as soon as they were like, oh, how are we integrating? Hey, how do we get our API key? And the first thing that they received was still the documentation. So. Okay, next up is Sandbox and testing environment. So you could do an entire talk just on this as well. But the major thing here is that not only do partners need to actually go ahead and build their integration, but they need to test it. And there's nothing better for going from 0 to 60 than them being able to sit down and curl a URL and essentially get a response back from Sandbox and like, huh, okay, that's how it works. That's how it's going. If you have a read-only API, you might even be able to get away with doing some sort of like testing in production and maybe like throttling responses and just whitelisting and blacklisting, because read-only is not necessarily as dangerous. But if you're trying to build a partner API where you're actually having data that's writing, I think it's imperative that you have some sort of Sandbox experience. For Guild's partner API, we actually had a hybrid approach that was proxying traffic from production for reading. And for writing, we had a completely separate isolated environment for inventory and orders, and all that stuff was in a separate database. The real win, I think, though, with Sandbox, at least for us, was you can actually look at all of your partners' requests. So you could go ahead and see from start to finish of a partner's integration, hey, this is the first request that this partner made trying to integrate, to, hey, this person is applying to go to production. Do they actually know how to cancel an order properly? And that brings me to my last point for onboard partners, which is a certification process to verify that a partner is ready for a production token. Having access to the entire logs, we essentially had a checklist for partners that they would submit with specific requests that they had already performed. And then with our Sandbox environment, we could literally just go straight down the line and say, hey, you were able to cancel an order, you're adhering to best practices for pulling inventory, you are checking SKU data at this particular time. And they would have to submit this with all their requests on a specific day and time. Another thing that we had to require as part of our certification process was partners would go ahead and submit usually a brief write-up, like 1 to 2 paragraphs of like what their integration looks like. This was actually kind of fun because engineers were typically not involved up until like the very end from the build side once we got a good process going. And then at the end, some partners actually who were using us as their sole platform actually would submit videos of like their product being demoed. And so the engineering teams would get to connect over the integration and actually kind of geek out about it, which was fun. And some people were actually really proud of what they built, so they'd talk about it, and they'd be excited to talk with people like Gilt. And it was always nice to hear that they enjoyed or appreciated like our documentation, or they thought our API was thoughtful. So to kind of conclude the story, it took us a couple iterations initially, but eventually we onboarded a lot of partners and made 7 figures in annual revenue through the API. And very important, Gilt was happy. Even more important, our partners were happy and their customers were happy. And that is a direct quote from our partners. And that's it. Thanks, guys. Any questions? Any questions? Yes? Yeah. The question was about ongoing support after the API was built. So initially, after the integration, like we moved them directly to production, we typically would have one engineer that was on call to make sure that things were going fine initially. But after that, they were typically only interacting with our partner manager from our international team. Sort of like after the integration kind of like reached a steady state, it usually wasn't any issues. Occasionally, we would do weekly meetings with our partner managers, and they would kind of say like, hey, this person is like interested in trying to do this feature, or they requested that we have, they were curious if they could change this about their integration somehow. But typically, we were very hands-off after the integration was kind of signed off on, and engineers were not really directly contacted. Arun? Yes, actually. We had a partner actually, this is kind of abuse. Yeah, this is abuse, not spamming. The question was, do we have to deal with any spam or abuse? We actually had a partner who was purchasing products that were not in the API. So we only had excess product that was available in there initially, and we ended up having somebody who was actually scraping Gilt.com for products that were like much higher end and were not in this excess inventory pile, and started submitting orders for it. So we shut that down very fast after our international team came to us and was like, hey, like how is this happening? But yeah, so there were cases of abuse. We kept working with that partner because they put through a lot of sales. So you can tolerate people if it means good things for the company. Any other questions? Cool. Thanks, guys.